And good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world. And welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 24. And we're going to be looking this evening at Wellington's British Army. As always, to give people a bit of time to join the stream, whether it's on YouTube or on X, I'm going to start us off with a tune.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness, on flooded folk and wall. Your new God's sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror, and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love that heed and folly, bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living, and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor, are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom, to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall wail gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come thou to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with give or wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden through all of thankless years.
And that was, of course, the excellent Chris Gard. Do go and check out his channel on YouTube if you like good music. Good evening to my guests, Aaron Hook and Mitch. I don't know if we're going to have anyone else join us this evening. We shall see. And we're going to be talking about the Duke of Wellington's army. People may recall that a few months ago we did a video in this series. It was one of our early ones on Nelson's Royal Navy. And so the idea is that this evening's video is going to be British Army version of that. It'll be a little bit different in that, of course, Nelson was killed in 1805, and although his influence remained with the Royal Navy for a long time, Wellington, of course, didn't die until the 1850s and was, in fact, Commander-in-Chief of the Army quite late on in his life. And he's received some criticism for that sort of thing. On the other hand, actually, he probably did a better job than some people realize, but we'll talk about that in a bit. I thought we would start off this evening talking a little bit about basic weapons and tactics, so that when we come to talk a little bit more about some of the battles that the army fought, people will have a better idea of what was going on. I also watched an interesting video yesterday, I think it was. And let me just check. I want to get the guy's name right. It was by a guy who does a lot of American War of Independence reenactment called Brandon Fischella. And he's got a fairly good channel. I've watched quite a few of his videos. But the one I watched yesterday was called The Musket, and how accurate are muskets really, muskets range and accuracy. And, I don't disagree with most of what he said on that stream. And I'm certainly not arguing against some of the things he said on the stream. I mean, could a musket kill you at 400 yards? Yeah, absolutely it could. But if one guy was firing at you at 400 yards, you'd be very, very unlucky to be hit. Very unlucky indeed. Just because they are not all that accurate. If you want to see how accurate smoothbore muskets are, go and watch Rob's channel, the guy who runs British muzzle loaders. He does lots of practical shooting with all sorts of historic firearms, but including brown breast muskets and also Baker rifles, by the way, which the Rifle Brigade used to use, the 95th. Go and watch his channel, and he's a pretty good shot, and he's been practicing for a long time. I'm sure he's as good a shot as the average soldier in the army was back then. And yeah, you're not going to hit what you're aiming at in terms of a one-man size target at 400 yards, and you're probably not going to hit him at 200 yards. Normally speaking, if you were skirmishing, you were an extended order and you were a light company or a light infantry regiment, and you were skirmishing, you might fire at the French at 200 yards, perhaps even 250 yards, given that these guys were doing that on their own, or actually in files at 2 men is how they usually did it. But you probably weren't going to hit much at that distance. And if you were a battalion company or a grenadier company and you were formed up in a 2-deep line, which is what the Brits used in those days, you probably were not going to open fire beyond 150 yards if you had good officers. And particularly, you weren't going to fire your first volley beyond 150 yards, because the first volley with muzzle loading weapons that you were able to load at your leisure and in peace and not under fire was always going to be your most effective volley, just because you could load it as slowly as you needed to and you weren't under stress or under fire from the enemy. And people wouldn't leave their ramrods in their barrels, which is a fairly common thing for a soldier to do. And if you fired your ramrod off, you weren't able to load your weapon again after that, unless you could get one off of a casualty or something. So you were very unlikely to open fire as a British regiment in line much beyond 150 yards, and if you could, you preferred to do it even closer. And one of the things that I want to bring out in this stream is this idea that you get in the Sharp books and TV shows, for example, of two regiments standing there and trading volleys. Yes, it did happen, but it was rare. Most of Wellington's battles, that's not what happened. Most of
Yeah.
Wellington. Sorry, Mitch, you carry on.
I was just saying, because I know, like, it wasn't just a British army, but like I know that the Swedish army used to do this, where you do like a couple of volleys and then you charge, because the British army, for example, was a lot smaller than the French, so we couldn't afford heavy casualties like the French could. So that's kind of like why we do.
There is that, yeah. There is that for sure, but also it's not a way to win decisively. Even if you win a long musketry duel, you're going to suffer quite a few casualties yourself, even if you win. So it's not decisive. Could well-trained British soldiers fire 3 shots a minute? Yes, they could. Absolutely, yes, they could. And occasionally, that was a useful skill to have. Like, say, for example, before the stream, we were talking about the Battle of Albura, where my family regiment, or rather the regiment my family had the honour to belong to be more accurate, where they got their nickname, the Diehards, which was the Battle of Albura. Now, in that battle, it absolutely did happen that a British line and a French line would exchange volley after volley after volley, and being able to fire a little bit more quickly was absolutely an advantage, and perhaps to aim a little bit better was absolutely an advantage. But that was not what happened in most of Wellington's battles, particularly when he was fighting a defensive battle. And Wellington did not only fight defensive battles. I mean, you can look at battles like Salamanca and Vittoria, which were absolutely offensive battles. But when he did fight a defensive battle, particularly because he was outnumbered, as Mitch correctly said, he would try and position his troops when he could on a reverse slope position. Now, the advantage of this is, first of all, the enemy can't see you, which is obviously an advantage. And secondly, the French artillery mostly couldn't fire at you, because most artillery in the Napoleonic era was direct fire. The weapons that weren't, in terms of field artillery, were howitzers. And the howitzers were always a minority of the guns on the battlefield. A French artillery battery would normally have 8 guns, and only 2 of them would be howitzers. A British artillery battery would normally have 6 guns, and 1 of them would be a howitzer. Although the Brits had a slight advantage in that they had shrapnel shells, which the French did not, which were basically an explosive shell that were filled with musket balls. So when they fired, they actually did a lot more damage. And of course, it's where we get the term shrapnel. They were invented by a British officer called Shrapnel. Anyway, so Wellington would try and put his troops in a reverse slope position. If he couldn't do that, he would get them to lie down. And again, it made it harder for the enemy to spot them. And also, though, it would reduce their casualties, particularly from enemy artillery fire. And the tactic was, when the French got to within about 100 yards, was to stand up very suddenly. The officers would order the men to stand up, or if they were below the crest, they would march up to the crest. And so all of a sudden, the French, who were almost invariably in columns, would be confronted by this long British line. And normally it would outflank their columns, because, if you get a battalion of, say, 600 guys, and they're in a 2-deep line, they will actually outflank a much larger number of Frenchmen in the column. And what would normally happen then is they would fire 1 or occasionally 2 or 3 volleys at the French. The head of the French column would disintegrate. Their officers and NCOs would be killed, and there would be confusion. And then the Brits would give a cheer and put a bayonet charge in. And almost invariably, the French would go tumbling down the hill or wherever they'd come from. Almost invariably. The number of times that there were long stand-up firefights in Peninsular War battles, it wasn't that common. It wasn't that common in the Peninsula, and it didn't happen very often at Waterloo either. Normally, you you would fire one or at the most about 3 volleys to disorganize the French column, and then you would charge them. Aaron, Mitch, what would you like to say initially in terms of stuff about the weapons and tactics and what have you?
I know, like, I can't remember which French general who said it. I think it was someone like Marmont or someone else who said, "Oh, the reverse slope tactic was a tired old dodge." I never understood the point of that quote, to be honest, because I mean it's a valid tactic to use, and there's nothing morally wrong with using the terrain to advantage. I mean, who wouldn't use the terrain to their advantage? But yeah, but I was up a lot of the French marshals have a kind of attitude where they just somehow considered Wellington dishonourable for using that manner of terrain to his advantage and shielding his men from their artillery.
Well, certainly Napoleon would not have agreed with that, because Napoleon would use every advantage of terrain that he could. I mean, every general would who had any common sense. You know, it's like.
I just saw it as them being sore losers rather than them actually acting like a logical basis of it. Because you got to factor in how many French marshals like Marmont have their reputations smashed by dealing with Wellington and just getting trounced.
Yeah, and of course at Waterloo, Napoleon said to his marshals, "Oh, you only think Wellington's a good soldier, a good general, and the British are good soldiers because they beat you in Spain." And of course, the only time Napoleon himself was in Spain, he was there with an enormous army. And the British at that stage were under Sir John Moore. And Sir John Moore did not think that Portugal could be defended against the French. As a consequence, he rushed off into Spain, and he did draw away a lot of French forces from Madrid and what have you. And they chased after him, and eventually he fought a successful battle where he got killed at Corunna in the north of Spain before the British army was evacuated. But the difference between Sir John Moore and the Duke of Wellington, or Sir Arthur Wellesley as he still was at the time, was that Wellington thought you could defend Portugal, and of course he was correct in this.
Yeah, I think Beresford was he the guy who built the lines to Torres Vedras, so they had that massive fortify Lisbon, which is a fortunate defensive position in terms of like narrow land access to the place, but also nothing was I can't remember how long ago it was, but someone like I remember some French guy going, "Oh well, Wellington was so successful because he was because basically his opponents were just retarded," and I'm sort of thinking, I just understood that excuse, because it's like you take Marmont for example. I mean, he became a marshal for a reason. It wasn't just that, you know. Well, yeah, you got guys like Soult and others who they had a lot of merit before they went against Wellington.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
it's like for example,
all of the marshals that were sent against Wellington in the peninsula, he defeated every single one of them. And as you said, Mitch, these guys didn't get promoted to Marshal of France for no reason. They were good soldiers, you know.
Yeah, I mean the thing was for example, Salamanca, where the entire French battle plan is just a load of crap because it's all based on false assumptions. Like they all think Wellington's pulling away, and go, no, he's not. So, and that's I often see French people, like French nationalists, often use that as a cop, going, "Oh well, Wellington only won because some of our generals just happened to be idiots." And I go, "No, or I just say that as more of a general French thing. Like for example, in the lead up to Victoria, he managed to cut his supply lines by having his main port at northern Spain. I can't remember, Santander or something like that.
Yeah,
up in northern Spain. So, and the French thought that was impossible. And that's the one thing common thing about French military history is they always think, "Oh well, we couldn't do that, so the British can't do it either," and then they get surprised when it's actually possible for our side to do it.
Yeah, and it's also worth pointing out the other reason Wellington could do that was because the Royal Navy dominated the waters around the Iberian Peninsula. I mean, that was one reason that Britain could fight in the Iberian Peninsula, was because the Royal Navy dominated the seas all around it. And, the French couldn't do anything about that, given that the Battle of Trafalgar was in 1805 and the Peninsular War really started in 1808. So, and Napoleon made a huge error in thinking that he could take over Spain, or Portugal for that matter, because the Spanish people didn't like the French there. The vast majority of the Spanish people, there were Spanish people who supported the French, but they were very much a minority. And although, with one exception, at Belen, the Spanish defeated a French army, but this was very unusual. In general terms, although the Spanish did quite well in sieges when the French were besieging them, in general terms, the Spanish field armies were beaten time after time after time, but they always formed new ones. And of course, even when that wasn't happening, you had the guerrillas, you had the guerrilla war, the Little War, that was going on all over Spain, which meant that French supply lines would get cut, that small French convoys would get ambushed, that messages would get intercepted, and Wellington would get a lot of intelligence that way. And, the peninsula was described as the Spanish ulcer of Napoleon, and it really was. And Napoleon's problem was that if he dispersed his armies, in order to actually hold down the country and stop the guerrillas doing very much, then the British and Portuguese army was able to defeat small French detachments. So therefore the French had to combine in order to be large enough to defeat the Anglo-Portuguese army. And when they did that, they couldn't hold all the countryside, so the guerrillas would break out again. So it was in the French were in a very awkward position. Aaron, you haven't said anything. What do you have to say about the stuff we're talking about at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing at this point we should mention, and this is the difference between Wellington and his French opponents in Spain, is that Wellington understood very clearly, like Marlborough has entered before, the importance of logistics, of supply, and he made sure he got that in place. And this is a contrast with the French, who are very much doing this sort of living off the land method of supply to a degree. And also the French don't have the same discipline Wellington instills in the British army. And so these two things are what are sort of the things in the background of all of Wellington's actions in Spain and Portugal, sort of that fundamentally secured victory. The fact that
look, Wellington realised that don't get things wrong. British soldiers were certainly not saints.
No.
But in general terms, they didn't steal huge amounts of supplies from the local peasantry, whereas the French did, because under the French system they had to, because the French only supplied very basic supplies to their troops. It was one of the reasons Napoleonic French armies could move all over Europe, is because they didn't provide their soldiers with proper supplies a lot of the time. But of course, in Spain, large armies starve and small armies are defeated, as the saying goes. So,
I think the problem with the French was that you got the fact that they had conscription, so most of their guys were peasants, and they probably weren't getting paid that well, so they had to compensate for it through looting. You also get the generals like Soult, I think it was Soult or Massena, who looted from loads of churches and monasteries to a point of like 1.5 million francs worth of Catholic art. So
lots of French officers also looted. It was quite common for French officers to loot. And of course, the war in the peninsula, because of the guerrilla war, which is where we get the term guerrilla war these days, because of that, it got quite vicious, and the Spanish guerrillas would, and also sometimes the Portuguese militia as well, would murder wounded Frenchmen. The British Army wouldn't do that, but the Spanish and Portuguese peasants would, and the French would also be extremely nasty to the peasants. There was a lot of rape and murder and all that sort of thing going on from the French.
Yeah, the only anomaly to that was Suchet of Aragon, but that was, well, with the exception of that, yeah, the vast majority of Spain just suffered massively. And,
Suchet did try and stop that sort of stuff going on, and actually had less problems in his province as a result. But
yeah, it's like Napoleon said, if he had a couple more generals like Suchet in Iberia, the problem would have been solved. But I mean, I'm sad of them. That's just, as I said, a lot of Napoleon's quotes, I'm probably thinking of him in my head, are just more, I don't know, post hoc statements of, perhaps you should have thought a bit better more. He only saying it now as a matter of regret, I suppose. And what's more, I mean, I haven't read too much about the guerrilla war, but if it's anything like what the Russian peasants would do to any soldiers they caught of the Grand Army, then yeah, I can imagine how brutal it would be.
Oh, it was at least as bad as that, Mitch. It was at least as bad as that. In Spain, you would have women and children nailed to doors in villages and stuff like that. So it was very nasty.
Yeah, and one thing that Wellington also would do is because obviously you've got the French who are looting things and, as you mentioned, sort with the religious robbing churches. Wellington made sure that his army, and particularly his officers, respected the Spanish and Portuguese people's religion, even though he obviously had at the time in Britain a common sort of anti-Catholic element. He made sure that his men didn't make artists of themselves, and sort of respected things like, for example, when the host was going past, he'd make them remove the hats out of respect. Small things like that would work in the
and of course, and Aaron, of course, Wellington's Irish regiments would have no problem with that whatsoever.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely, you're quite correct. Duke Valentino is saying how effective were the guerrillas. I think we've been kind of explaining that they were pretty effective, actually, because they used to provide Wellington with a lot of intelligence information from couriers who they would ambush and this kind of stuff, and orders they intercepted. And also they meant that very small detachments of the French simply couldn't operate in a lot of the country because they would be destroyed. It got to the stage that sometimes in some provinces, you had to have a whole cavalry squadron escorting a messenger because any smaller force than that would get killed or captured. And if they got captured, they generally got killed.
One good example was Battle of Vittoria. Was it 24th of June or 21st of June, something like that, when it was for? Because the day after, Clausel was to be reinforced in Joseph. So it was a matter of the guerrillas were a massive game changer in regards to how, I don't think Wellington could have been that successful in terms of intelligence at the very least without the guerrillas supporting him. And yeah, and that's the thing about Wellington was he was very disciplinarian. So on one hand,
he was, and he had to be in some respects. I mean, we're going to come on to talk about this in a minute, but AI, good evening. How are you going?
I'm all right, thank you, Iron Duke. I thought I'd pop in because I have taken interest in the Peninsular War. It's a name that you probably will recognise, but Charles Oman has written very extensively.
Great book. It's a great multi-volume history, and I thoroughly recommend it.
Yes,
it was written between 1902 and 1930, I believe.
Yeah, I think it was one of his last ones. Actually, it was his final.
One of the things that's great about it, AI, is that he lived in a time certainly initially. I mean, he started writing this just as the Anglo-Boer War finished. And he lived in a time where horses were still vitally important to the military and were still used by civilians. And so therefore he has a much better understanding of armies' movements and what have you than a modern historian, because these days we don't have much to do with horses these days.
I
And
believe
they were
in
absolutely vital to a Napoleonic army.
Yeah, I believe in his when he was a young man, because when he was younger, when he was writing particularly about Rome and the Dark Ages and the Eastern Roman Empire, which is what he was known for before this, he did actually meet veterans from the Napoleonic Wars.
Oh yeah, I can believe that. Yeah, the very elderly guys for sure. I mean, in the same way as when I was like a teenager, I knew quite a lot of guys who were First World War soldiers. They're all dead now, but when I was a young chap, 50 years ago, or 45 years ago, there were still quite a few of them around.
Yeah, and I just caught the tail end, but talking about the guerrilla situation, the situation in Spain, I will add one thing very important was that the church, the Catholic Church, was very much at the heart of Spanish, resistance
Sure.
against France, and you have to remember, the French were conceived to be anti-clerical. Remember the French Revolution, the murders of nuns and priests and the clergy at large, and
Yep.
the atheism, which turned even the more radicals in America, who were quite pro-French, it turned them away from the French because of that. And particularly in Spain, when you had Napoleon's brother, who was put on the throne, this self-proclaimed King of Spain, Joseph. What you had was this unification of Catholics, and bearing in mind at that point, even up until the invasion, the Spanish Inquisition was still technically in effect within Spain in all Spanish territories. So there wasn't
although it was never as bad as it is sometimes portrayed. But yeah, okay.
Yeah. But it meant that there was no Protestantism. There was nothing there beyond the church in existence. So it became a very good rallying call. And I believe that was it Seville that down in right down in southern Spain, in that region, was the one area that the French never officially got into.
Well, they didn't capture all of it. No, that's true. However, this is mostly a stream about the British Army of Wellington's era, or at least his prime. So, I've already done at least one stream on the Peninsular War, and I know I owe people a part 2 of that, and we will do a part 2 on the Peninsular War at some point. But I want to bring us back to the British Army part of the stream, which is the main reason for this stream. So muskets, yes, they were, normally you use them at under about 150 yards. And you did that because they were more effective at that range. You could hit things at longer ranges, and people, the French, for example, often opened fire at longer ranges than 150 yards, but you could often throw your fire away by doing that. Artillery, which was the other arm, came in 2 varieties: foot artillery, where the gunners marched, and horse artillery, where the gunners were mounted. And of course, the foot artillery was also pulled by horses, but the gunners marched in that. And the artillery had to be a bit more professional than some of the other arms. Wellington's worst arm, without doubt, was his cavalry. He was mostly short of cavalry in the peninsula. It was only towards the end of the Peninsular War that in 1812, 1813 and 1814 that he started to get decent numbers of British cavalry. And because you need space to do cavalry manoeuvres, and particularly if you're going to train cavalry brigades, so 2 or more regiments together, you need quite a lot of space to do that. And Britain is not especially good for training cavalry in that regard. And so British cavalry didn't tend to train together very much as brigades. And how good or bad a British cavalry regiment was depended almost entirely on its colonel and the officers that he got, and how professional they were. So there were good regiments of British cavalry, but there were also quite a few who were not so good.
Yeah, it was I forget his name, Lord Combermere, I think his name was, at Salamanca, who commanded the cavalry. Apparently, Wellington thought highly of him, but
yes.
But basically, yeah. But then when it comes to Waterloo campaign, Uxbridge went over because Uxbridge had royal patronage. So it was kind of.
And of course, Wellington didn't get on with Uxbridge because Uxbridge had run off with his sister. Sister-in-law. His sister-in-law, I should say.
Yeah, both were married at the time of Waterloo, so you can imagine the wound was still there, to say the least.
Yes.
Especially when you factor that younger brother did a lot to help Wellington in the Peninsular War regarding the Portuguese government and so on.
Yes, this is very true. But Wellington and Uxbridge didn't really get on, and so therefore Wellington didn't always have good cavalry commanders. So Stapleton Cotton wasn't bad. He was a not bad British cavalry commander, but many of the others not so much.
Do you remember the officer in Sharp, Simmons, the one that was like the incompetent officer?
Mm-hmm.
I believe he was based, Bunnacorn based him off a real officer in Wellington's army, and I cannot for the life remember, but it was apparently based off a real one that was known to be quite incompetent. It might have been a cavalry officer. I can't.
Well, Wellington never trusted his British cavalry. He always said that he was always fairly confident that one British squadron would beat one French squadron. He was always pretty confident of that because the British cavalry was always well mounted because we bred good horses in England. But he said if it was 4 squadrons versus 4 squadrons, he always thought the French would win because they were better at manoeuvring than the British were. Not better at charging, but better at manoeuvring. The other thing that Wellington was always short of in the Peninsular War was siege artillery and also engineers. And at this stage, in the Napoleonic era, the engineers were divided into 2 units. The officers were Royal Engineers, as indeed they are today, but the men were different and were called sappers and miners. And these were the guys you wanted when you had to dig trenches when you were besieging somewhere. And Wellington was always short of both Royal Engineers and sappers and miners, and he was also mostly short of heavy siege guns as well. Duke of Valentino is saying, were there many Irish Catholic officers in Wellington's army? Officially, you could not be a Catholic and be an officer in the British Army or the Royal Navy, but in fact, there were quite a few who were and just didn't go on about it publicly. And if you didn't go on about it publicly, you were generally left alone, to be honest. Sorry, you were saying, Ali?
Yeah, because wasn't there foreign units at the time, like the Swiss and some Royalist French?
Yes, there were. There were a number of foreign units. Of course, the King's German Legion, who were from Hanover originally, but actually formed part of the British Army, was some of Wellington's best troops, and also the King's German Legion cavalry, unlike the British cavalry, had a very good professional reputation. Unlike most of the British cavalry, I should say.
I mean, because that's the thing. Is like, 'cause obviously, if they were royalists, they would have been Catholic, probably quite very Catholic, and also, as I mentioned earlier, with the Spanish.
Yes.
Spanish again, very Catholic. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
the French originally formed, the French royalists formed the Chasseurs Britanniques. But the thing was,
Yeah.
after the original royalists who formed that unit became casualties, the only way the British were able to keep them up to strength was by literally taking volunteers from the French POWs who we'd captured in the war, and the Chasseurs Britanniques, as a result of this, got a terrible reputation for desertion, because quite a few French POWs would join this regiment in order to get sent to Spain and then desert and go back to the French, which you would expect.
Yeah, that sounds like a bit of a obvious thing that could happen.
Yeah, so yes, you had that, but you also did have Swiss units in the British Army. The Portuguese, of course, eventually about between a quarter and a third of Wellington's army was Portuguese, and the Portuguese army had a lot of British officers, and the way they got them was if a lieutenant volunteered for the Portuguese army, he got a step in rank to captain. And if he was a captain, he got a step in rank to a major. And if he was a major, of course, he got a step to lieutenant colonel. So lots of British officers volunteered for this. And they also had quite a lot of British NCOs as well who drilled. So there were quite a few British sergeants in the Portuguese army as well.
And also some Greeks, the famous Greek independence war hero, Theodorus Kolokotronis was present.
I don't know if they were in Spain, but there was certainly a Greek light infantry regiment in the British Army that was operating in the Eastern Mediterranean. I don't think they were ever in the Peninsular War, but there was a Greek regiment, and of course the 60th, who were originally the Royal Americans and eventually became the King's Royal Rifle Corps, the other rifle regiment aside from the Rifle Brigade in the British Army. The 60th were largely Germans by the time of the Peninsular War. But yeah, there were foreign regiments. Someone in the chat was mentioning the Irish troops in the Spanish Royalist forces, and there were a number of Irish officers and Irish soldiers in the Spanish army. Yes, that's true. And soldiers weren't pressed at all, Duke Valentino. Occasionally, petty criminals would be given the choice of joining the army or going to jail, going to prison, but that was not that common. And in general terms, British soldiers were volunteers. Now, yes, sometimes they volunteered because they couldn't get a job and they were hungry, but they were volunteers. There was no conscription for the army, and you were far less likely to be pressed into the army than you were into the navy. And as we have pointed out on other streams, you could only really be pressed into the navy within a few miles of the coast or at major ports. And generally, they wanted sailors rather than landsmen.
Yeah, I know. Another thing with the British Army was so. One stereotype of British Army back in those days was that, oh, well, the aristocrats were all idiots and the soldiers were all poorly led. And they go, no, there was, I think, a 42nd at Quatre Bras, for example, when their aristocratic officer, Robert McCarver, I think his name was, got killed. The Scotsmen just all went ballistic at the French, refusing to take any prisoners. So there was a strong sense of, what would you call it? Esprit de corps? I don't know what.
Yeah, there was. Yes, and although obviously the relations between officers and men were more distant then than they are today, there was a good relationship between good officers and their men. You know, and there were the British Army was in the days before all the amalgamations, which have made all the regiments almost the bloody same now. Such few as we have left. But back in the day, the British Army was extremely tribal. Every regiment had its own facing colours on its collar and cuffs, and they would have different patterns of lace and all this kind of stuff. And they're obviously their own badges, and the colours of the regiment would have the battle honours, and they would be the regimental colour in the line regiments was always the facing colour that was on the collar and cuffs of their red jackets. So it was very tribal. There were British Army regiments who would always get into a fight with each other, usually from some incident 100 years ago in another battle somewhere. But there were also regiments that were traditional friends.
Yeah,
also usually because of something that had happened in a battle 100 years ago. Sorry, you were saying, Mitch?
I can't remember which regiment it was, but there was one regiment where it was like they were similar with Brunswickers. Just after, I think it was like Cotrobot or between Cotrobot and Waterloo. This one British regiment had a dog they adopted in the area of Belgium. But then the Brunswickers, like these German fellas, decided they wanted they ate the dog. And this particular regiment, they just went, okay, they got revenge by poisoning the guys who ate the dog. And apparently that particular incident was still remembered back in the First World War when those
doesn't surprise me. Doesn't surprise me at all. British soldiers have always adopted dogs wherever they've gone. I'm sure they did it all over the peninsula for sure.
I can give, of course, an ancient sort of analogy there with Alexander when he was besieging the city of Tyre. Two hoplites were basically, I guess, from they were all like bragging about who is fastest, strongest, and could get over into the city first. They started drinking, and then out of some sort of drunken level of excitement, they all sort of charged to try and climb the wall, and they did actually succeed in getting on top of the walls.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Adaman's asking in the chat, did the 73rd Hanover Fusiliers fight alongside the British during the Peninsular War? They might have done if they were part of the King's German Legion, if that was if that's how they trace their ancestry. But also, don't forget, a lot of Hanoverian regiments fought alongside the British at Waterloo as well. So it could have been from then. So yeah. But certainly
governed by France.
Yeah, there were a lot of German regiments that had Waterloo on their colours, for example, in 1914 to 18. So yeah, but yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the men. I mean, there's comments in the chat about press gangs and what have you. And really, there weren't press gangs for the army. They just weren't. I'm sorry. Like I said, occasionally a petty criminal would be given the choice of joining the army or going to prison, but that was about as far as it went. But yeah, but Adaman, if the Hanover Fusiliers, and I'm no expert on the German army, but if they trace themselves back to a King's German Legion unit, then they certainly could have fought in the peninsula.
Actually, just to ask a question here about the army and the situation. So, before 1801, Ireland was not technically a part. It wasn't its own kingdom within the United Kingdom. It was still the lordship of well, sorry, not lordship, I should say, the kingdom of Ireland.
Yeah.
It was the kingdom of Ireland. That was it, but it wasn't part of the United Kingdom until 1801, when it was admitted into the Union as a whole. What beforehand? What were regiments created due down to that, or were they already existing regiments present?
Regiments counted their seniority from when they were formed. So the oldest regiment in the British Army is the 1st Foot, the Royal Scots, whose nickname is Pontius Pilate's bodyguard because they're so old. And they're the oldest regiment in the British Army. After that, it's the 2nd Foot, then the 3rd Foot, which is the Buffs, of course, and so on. And so, for example, my family regiment, the Middlesex, were the 57th Foot. And you would get a famous Irish regiment like the Connaught Rangers. They were the 88th Foot, for example. And it was down to when they were formed or when they could trace their formation. Mitch has pointed out to me that the 73rd Fusiliers in the German army did serve at Basoko and Barroso and Albura, and they were part of the King's German Legion. So there you go. Thanks, Mitch. That was Asimman's question. So they were part of the King's German Legion, and as I said, King's German Legion battalions certainly did serve in the peninsula and had a very good reputation as very professional units. Coldstream Guards. The Guards are all a bit different, Alabaster. So obviously the Grenadiers are the senior regiment of Guards. The Coldstream are the second senior, Scots are the third, and then the Irish and then the Welsh Guards. But because they're not in the line, they're a separate unit. But the Coldstream Guards are pretty ancient as well, as are the Grenadiers. The thing is, one of the reasons that you have a Royal Navy and even a Royal Air Force, but you have a British Army, is because most of the British Army really traces its ancestry to Cromwell's New Model Army. Not all of it, but most of it. So this is why it's not the Royal Army and never has been. People foreigners sometimes get it wrong and they think it's the Royal Army. It's not. Blues and Royals are actually two units who've been amalgamated. The Blues and the Royals were two different units. Originally, the Household Cavalry was 2 regiments of Life Guards and 1 regiment of the Royal Horse Guards, but they were amalgamated. I do believe that in that story, yes, they did actually eat a dog, sadly. The American Red Indians used to do it all the time, sadly, but there we go. And the Chinese indeed still do, I believe. Yes, Duke Valentino, the Irish Guards, most Irish Guardsmen actually do come from Southern Ireland. And there's always been a number of Southern Irishmen who've served in the British Army. It's never been, you've always been able to join the British Army if you come from Ireland.
When I was in Cyprus, there were one of our neighbours were in the army, and they were from the Republic. Yeah, so yeah, there's always quite a few.
Yeah, you've always been able to do that, and of course you have the I don't even know what they're called today, but there is a regiment based in Northern Ireland. I'm not sure what their name is at the moment, because I get most of the British regiments have been amalgamated now, and so most of them, if you look at the colours of a modern British regiment, the battle honours are almost all the same because they've all been amalgamated so many times. I mean, there are only 70,000 regular soldiers in the whole of the British Army. It's never been this tiny, ever in its history. I mean, to get a British Army smaller than it is today, you would have to go back to the late 1600s, I should think. Baron Badger is saying the Royal Irish Regiment. I'm sure that's right, Baron. Thank you. Okay, so we've talked about that. Let's talk a little bit about, guys join the army. When we were looking at the Royal Navy, of course, sailors tended to join the Royal Navy who were already sailors for the most part. And just because the Royal Navy had some advantages, as we spoke about, in terms of regular pay, regular rations, probably slightly less work because there were more men on a Royal Navy ship than a merchant ship, because you had to be able to man the guns, of course. And also you had the chance of prize money. In the army, there were less good reasons for joining, in that sense. In that a soldier wasn't going to get prize money as a rule. You could, but yeah, I just mentioned prize money, Alabaster. But yeah, you could occasionally get prize money in the army if the army captured a load of stuff. but it was much less common than in the Navy. But you did, of course, have the opportunity to loot occasionally. For example, after the Battle of Vittoria, some millions in French gold disappeared, and most of it went into soldiers' pockets. And so you could always do that. You always had the chance of being able to do that, and particularly if you took part in something like storming a town like Badajoz, for example.
Sacking of Washington in 1812, same thing.
Yes, absolutely. You always had the opportunity to do some looting in that regard, and of course you did get regular food that was quite reasonable by the standards of working class civilians, and quite plentiful mostly when it arrived. Sometimes there were troubles with supplies, of course.
Would this be allowed in Spain though? Because the Spanish people are meant to be they were the nominal allies of Britain against
No,
France.
you weren't supposed to do it, AI. But after storming French-held towns, particularly at Badajoz, where the officers lost control of their troops for a while, there was a lot of looting going on, and there was always a certain amount of low-level looting. If you got caught, you could be hung. You could be flogged or hung, and that happened because it would drive Wellington loopy when his soldiers became indisciplined. But there was always a certain amount of looting going on, of course. And as I say, for example, at Vittoria, the Wellington got very angry about this because it delayed the pursuit of the French, and so less French were captured than would have been otherwise. But this was the French baggage that had all this loot and gold and what have you in it, and that was what the British soldiers were looting. So it wasn't from the Spanish, it was from the French, although some of that stuff had been looted by the French from the Spanish, but there you go.
Yeah.
So there was always a certain amount of low-level looting that went on. And if you got caught, yes, you could absolutely be flogged or be hung. Flogging was not as common in the army as people think it was. Most soldiers were not flogged. Some soldiers were flogged a lot. It was very much the same as in the Navy. The guys who got flogged generally got flogged a lot because they were always doing something wrong, whereas most soldiers weren't flogged at all.
I think when we covered Wellington's army in India, the incident that involved flogging was when there was a couple. I believe that there was a rape and a burning of a property.
Mm-hmm.
That warranted executions and flogging. Yeah,
that certainly would happen. Yes, for sure it would. Wellington infamously said that his soldiers were the scum of the earth, all enlisted for drink. And yes, British soldiers, but also French soldiers, Spanish soldiers, Portuguese soldiers, German soldiers, they would all get drunk in those days if they got the chance. It was quite common. So he wasn't totally wrong when he said that, but he also put a caveat on that at the end when he said, but it is wonderful the fine fellows we have made them. Wellington soldiers were certainly capable of getting beastly drunk and doing nasty things. They were. There's no doubt of that whatsoever. They weren't little peaceful, saintly boys. They were rough soldiers, Yes. I mean, even World War II British soldiers did a certain amount of looting, Some of them more than others, Some soldiers had a reputation for looting every dead and captured German they came across.
If you watch Iron Duke, that Peter Jackson one, They Shall Not Grow Old, where he went through old World War I footage, you will see there's one scene where there's a trench full of dead Germans. It's quite early on in the war. And by the looks of it, the trench had been stormed by the British, and the British captured the trench and killed many. And you see soldiers going and just like taking watches and wallets and other things from the bodies there, which was it was aired at one of our our local library, and it was quite a few people were aghast of it, and it was like. I remember watching it, and there's quite a few people quite shocked, and it was like, well, that's how it went, That's
Yeah, of course it did. Yeah.
It's like, what I was like surprised is like there's one German soldier in the frame who has got half his head missing. What do you think these men were out for a fucking picnic or something?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, my grandfather came home from fighting, from D-Day all the way through to the German surrender, and he had 3 good German watches when he came home. I'm sure he didn't buy them. It's like.
So my grandfather bought back it's like ivory and like modelled Japanese figures and stuff, and again I'm certain he didn't purchase those.
Yeah, very true. I mean, but yeah, these guys were not plaster saints, as Kipling recognised in the late 19th century. Single men in barracks do not grow into plaster saints. So yeah, some of them were quite rough. Some of them would have been thieves in civilian life. Not all of them, though. And were there guys who joined up for adventure? Yes, there were. There were young guys who joined the army as a private for adventure. And also, if you were a guy who could read and write, you needed to be able to read and write. But if you could do that, you could get promotion and become a corporal and then a sergeant, etc. That was possible. There were guys who did that. There were also NCOs who, for example, if you captured a French Eagle, all the French infantry units had an Eagle standard, and if you captured one of those things and you were a sergeant or a private, you would normally be given. If you were a private, you'd normally be made a sergeant, but if you were a sergeant, you'd be given a commission. They'd make you a commissioned officer. And there was an Irish guy, Masterman, I think his name was. I think it was Masterman, who captured a French Eagle in the Peninsular War, and he was made into an officer. And his son also followed him into the regiment as an officer. So it was a way of actually upping your class. Very, very hard to do, of course, and you were definitely risking your life if you were trying to capture a French Eagle standard, because the French soldiers would defend it fiercely. But if you could capture one, yeah, you could get a commission. And sometimes if you took part in a forlorn hope, which Mitch and I were talking about before we started, in the storming of a fortress, again, if you were a sergeant and you took part in the forlorn hope, you would normally be commissioned afterwards. So it was actually possible to go from being rank and file to becoming an officer in the Peninsular War, and it was a bit more common than some people would have you believe. I mean, the Sharp series is quite famous, of course, but that sort of thing did happen. It wasn't totally made up.
No, it's quite interesting because again, there are certain instances like we know them from the HBO series Rome, Titus Pullo and Varenus, but those were real individuals who Julius Caesar noted in his commentaries, because I believe during the siege of Alesia or Battle of Alesia?
It was Alesia.
Yeah, Alesia. They were able while they were surrounded, and he saw these two. I think either they were centurions at the time, or they were just regular sort of legionnaires or something like that, or some sort of prefecture position. I'm not entirely sure, but they were able
They were
both to
they
hold.
were centurions. Both of them
They
were
were
centurions.
they were
Yeah.
centurions, and they were able to hold their own, fight back, and be both be rewarded for it. Because and he noted their names down because he was incredibly impressed by their tenacity and but I mean that's all we know.
Yes.
We know that he rewarded them. That it most likely there was some sort of promotion, but of course HBO fills in the rest of it in the series like with
Oh
their own
yeah,
story.
for sure.
But
For sure.
we know that they would have been rewarded. It may have been. I think in the series, Titus Pullo is given sort of quite a large sum as a reward, which was
He
also
is.
possible.
Yeah.
But he may have been given a promotion. Both of them given promotion at the time.
Yeah, no, certainly that sort of thing did happen, and you could do it. Duke Valentino is asking how common was a forlorn hope. Every time you did a siege, when the breach was practicable, which meant that when troops could get up it into the enemy fortifications, it was always led by a forlorn hope, and that was usually an officer or sergeant, and however many men volunteered for it. And you would get a badge if you did it, something like a gallant stormer badge on your sleeve. But also the officer and the sergeant were always promoted. The officer would get a step in rank, and the sergeant would normally be commissioned if they survived. And then the privates who took part in that, if they were under punishment for some reason, that would be forgiven them. And if they weren't, they'd get promoted. So there was a reason for doing it. Mitch, Aaron, you haven't said anything for a while, guys. Observations at this stage?
Yeah, just to add two things. One about flogging. That people need to remember that corporal punishment was a normal part of civilian life. So when flogging happened in the British Army, it wasn't remarkable. It was part of the course for the men who were being flogged. They understood it as being a punishment that wouldn't have been much different from that they would necessarily have received in civilian life. And the other thing is that if you just look at the average officer in the British Army at this point, they wouldn't necessarily have been aristocratic. They would have been from probably a middle class background, but they would have had either their fathers would have been in the army, or their fathers would have been, say, in one of the professions, a lawyer, a gentleman farmer, something like that. So the idea of the British Army, so the general officer corps being the more broad officer corps being aristocratic, wasn't necessarily true at that point. There were obviously a significant portion of aristocratic army officers, but there's a large pool of non-aristocratic, roughly middle-class men in the British Army's British officers.
Absolutely, and we're going to come on to officers in a moment. Mitch, any observations at this point? You're muted at the moment, Mitch.
I'm yeah, as regarding, let's say, flogging. I mean, I remember reading about flogging that it wasn't as common as people think, as people think it was.
Yeah.
Like, fair enough if you were known to be a malingerer, which, to be fair, I mean, you didn't really have to do. I mean, it's kind of like what we said about the Royal Navy, you know, about sailors on a ship. The men will police each other because that's just what happens in a unit. If you've got a guy who slacks from work, he'll just get bullied by all his comrades until he starts shaping.
And even more if he's any sort of thief and he thieves from his comrades, that will get you into big trouble in the military.
Yeah, it's like what was his name? Peter Postlethwaite played him in. I can't remember his name from somewhere there, but that guys like that would just be. You imagine imagine an average soldier will probably just take him in the middle of the woods, and you just hear a gunshot. And
well, I was just going to say, Mitch, in the chaos of battle, it would be all too easy to get shot if you were an asshole, you know.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's quite interesting with the flogging examples is that it always comes up with the incident with the Frederick John White, who was flogged. What was it? Apparently, I think he assaulted an officer, a sergeant, and he was got 150 lashes with a cat of nine tails, and died as a result of that. In 1846, which then began the debate around, particularly by liberals and stuff, to reevaluate.
They did reduce the number of lashes that you could give. I mean, 150 was very high, but they did reduce the number that you could give. But in the Zulu War in 1879, British soldiers could still be flogged. It was only I think it was 1882 that they stopped it, somewhere around there.
What was?
Although having said that, it is said that some of the Chindits were flogged behind Japanese lines because there was nothing else they could do to them. You know, if you were behind Japanese lines, they couldn't exactly do anything else to you if they charged you.
Yeah, I was going to say, in the First War, in the First World War, wasn't there like you'd be tied to the post and be beaten up? Wasn't that a thing?
No. You're thinking of field punishment number 1, where you were tied to a wagon wheel. You weren't beaten up.
Yeah. That's the one. That's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah.
But you weren't beaten up. No.
Oh no, you just tied to a wagon wheel.
Yes. Aaron Hook is just saying in the chat there, it was 1882 in the Army and 1883 for the Navy. Although the number of lashes you could be given had been much reduced by that time, and it wasn't done that often. It wasn't common.
I wonder what Thomas Carlyle at the time, he would have said, "No, this is decline. This is like literally the decline of the British Army,"
Possibly. But yeah, anyway, let's get on to officers. And I mean, Aaron made the good point that although there were certainly aristocrats in the British Army, like Wellington himself, Wellington was an aristocrat from the Irish ascendancy. But there were, and it's fair to say that the British Army was a bit more aristocratic than the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy was always mostly a middle-class organisation in terms of its officers. The Army was a bit more aristocratic, but as Aaron correctly said, the vast majority of British Army officers would be regarded as middle-class these days. Yes, some of them would come from the professions. In terms of the aristocrats, by the way, they were mostly younger sons. If you were from an aristocratic family and you weren't the eldest son, so you weren't going to inherit the family estates or whatever, your options were fairly limited, really. It was basically the Navy, the Army, or the Church for the most part, and the Church of England in those days. And of course, that's what most of them did. But in terms of the majority of officers, they would be regarded as middle class. As I said before, it was perfectly possible for a reasonably educated sergeant who was brave and lucky to get promoted and become an officer, and his sons would very often then follow him into the same regiment. That was quite common. It was also very common for, as again Aaron pointed out, for sons to follow their fathers. The father served as an officer in an infantry regiment, and his sons would follow him and do the same thing. That was also very common.
Didn't the Duke of York institute some sort of reform with the commission system? Because was it served 2 years before becoming major?
They did. Yeah, there were limits. You couldn't simply keep. I mean, Wellington rose quite quickly because he was rich enough to be able to buy commissions. But that had the advantage that he was still a pretty young man when he was a major general. The system that replaced it, people think it was much better, but I'm not sure it was, because it tended to lead to more elderly officers, particularly in peacetime. But
Because one thing I find
but
with
you did have to serve a certain amount of time in each rank, and also you had to pay. They got rid of. Sometimes people would pay a lot extra for a particularly fashionable regiment or what have you, and they would pay over and above the official price, and this went on up until the Crimean War, but it was illegal, strictly speaking, but it did happen.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because when I've looked and we've done streams and we looked at, like, say, the company, the East India Company, or even the Canadian, the forces in Canada and stuff like that. One thing I noticed in both those scenarios, around this time frame, is that the officers in those places are actually quite considerably younger than the British officers in Europe, in the European theatre, with those regiments.
Not always, no. If you look at the officer's career, they would join their regiment as an ensign if they were in the cavalry. In the infantry, I beg your pardon. They would join as an ensign, and they were often guys of 17 or 18, and basically they were trainees in many respects. They were given minor responsibility in the field, but basically they were learning their trade, and then they would be promoted from ensign to lieutenant, and lieutenants were supposed to know their job, and then a company would be commanded by a captain. A battalion, which was anywhere from 500 to 900 men strong, depending. It varied a great deal, particularly on active service. A battalion was divided into 10 companies. You had 8 battalion companies. You had a grenadier company, which was the biggest men in the regiment, and often would lead assaults and things, although they didn't use grenades in Wellington's era. And you had a light company who were specifically trained in skirmishing, although they were still armed with Brown Bess muskets. And each company, which would be between 50 and 100 strong, was usually commanded by a captain. And he would have usually a lieutenant and a second lieutenant or an ensign under him. Then there would be 2 majors, and they would each command a wing, which is to say half the battalion, if you divided the battalion in half, which was sometimes done. And then the whole thing would be commanded by a lieutenant colonel, although they were called colonel, of course, but they were actually lieutenant colonels. A full colonel was usually the honorary colonel of a regiment and wasn't an active part of running the regiment at all. So, the officers, normally they were either the sons of officers, or as someone in the chat said, basically gentlemen, but gentleman was a pretty loose term, if you know what I mean.
One thing I think we should also point out, because that there was promotion within Wellington's army in the peninsula was obviously faster than it would have been back home, because then positions opened up.
Yes, and you didn't have to pay for them if that happened. If your battalion was in battle, and the guy who was next up from you in rank, if you were a lieutenant and the battalion lost 3 captains, those vacancies would be filled from the senior lieutenants in the battalion without any purchase. You didn't have to pay for them at all. And the same thing, of course, with people who died of sickness, which was also quite common for an army in the field.
Did they reduce the cost of a commission during the Napoleonic Wars?
Not as far as I know, anyway. Not as far as I know. But you got a lot more promotion without purchase because of the fact that you had casualties and guys who died of sickness and what have you.
Well, yeah, so you could quite easily go through the ranks.
So, well, if you were, for example, somebody like Sharp who had no money to buy a commission, you could get promotion actually a bit more easily than is shown in the movie, in the TV show rather, and in the books, because you'd have guys naturally being killed. You know, every battle you're going to lose some men. And as I say, if the officer above you in rank got killed, if you were the senior lieutenant, you would fill that position and it wouldn't cost you anything. So you would find officers who didn't have much money to buy commissions would want to go on active service because that's how they got promotion.
Yeah. And of course, Wellington, or Wellesley as he would have been then, he racked up quite a fair bit of debt to begin with.
He did, but then he made quite a lot of money while he was in India.
Yeah.
As did most officers when they were serving in India. But yeah, and of course, yeah, and also don't forget some battles, officers were given awards and what have you by the king and this sort of thing. So yeah. But yeah, I don't know. Anything, Mitch, Aaron, you want to bring up about the officers of Wellington's army or anything like that?
Not really. I've said everything on pretty much no, to be honest.
Mitch, you're muted at the moment.
In terms of some of your other members, Uxbridge, of course, had personal problems. Roland Hill was probably the most capable guy, but even then, Wellington did not have any sense of delegation, or delegating, I should say, to guys lower than him. They never had a chief of staff, unlike, say, Blucher with Gneisenau. So that's one thing about Wellington was, you have that famous little bit from Waterloo where Uxbridge goes, "Oh, what's a plan for if, let's say, you are indisposed during a battle, let's say wounded, whatever," and he goes, "Beat the French." And that was just generally what Wellington was known to be like in terms of just being rather brusque and not so very trusting of guys below. But you have Roland Hill, who
Daddy Hill, his troops called him. Roland Hill was called Daddy Hill by his troops because he looked after them.
Yeah, and I think in the lead up to the Battle of Salamanca, he was told to destroy this bridge at a place called Almiraf, which he did, and that helped Wellington win the Battle of Salamanca because Soult, for example, had to learn it the hard way that Marmont got defeated, and so it screwed up the French strategy for dealing with, for example, the French had to lift the siege of Cadiz, which they'd been doing about for like 2 years beforehand. You can imagine that's a massive demoralizer. Not to mention, the French had to abandon Madrid, so that was another consequence of, for example, I don't know how to summarize other than to say Wellington was not known for being very generous with the praise, I suppose. I
want to come on to that in a sec, Mitch. I just want to answer a couple of questions in chat. Duke Valentino says, who was the primary field marshal of the French in Spain? Was it Soult? Well, it varied, Valentino. There were various French marshals in Spain at various times. So there were quite a few, actually, and Wellington beat all of them, pretty much. Someone also asked, did they retain the rank after the war engagement? Yes, although you could get something called a brevet rank. So you could be, you might have the substantive rank in your regiment as a captain, say, but you might be a brevet major. So in your regiment, your substantive actual rank was Captain Fred Smith, but you might have a brevet as a major, which meant if you were serving outside your regiment, you would actually be rated as a major, and that stuff was temporary. But in general, if you got promotion because you were the senior captain, say, and you filled a dead major's position, then yes, you would hold that rank for good, for sure. Sorry, Mitch. Any other points on that before we move on to Wellington's good points and faults?
I'm assuming the primary French marshal for Spain would be something like Jourdan, because he was advising Joseph, especially at Vittoria, where you had guys like Clausel and the other commanders who they were subordinate to Jourdan. And Jourdan,
yeah, supposedly, but infamously, the French marshals didn't take a lot of notice of each other unless Napoleon was actually there. So,
well, even when like Napoleon was there, they'd still have issues. Like you had, for example, I mean, Jack mentioned like a while ago when we were doing Waterloo about Bernadotte just being a right little turd at battles like
he could be, yes, he could be.
Austerlitz. So it's kind of like even when Napoleon was still there, he couldn't deal with some of the rivalries, because that's the problem with, you got, and it's like you have Murat, who even when he got his kingdom of Naples off the generosity of Napoleon, didn't stop Georges Murat from betraying Napoleon, and then like doing like a double agent and triple agent at times.
Yes.
And then Bernadotte, of course, and then you have Marmont, who, in his old age, he was remarked as the guy who betrayed Napoleon. So it's kind of like, I don't know, just very competitive, I suppose you could say. I mean,
it was. It definitely was, and of course, Napoleon's brother, who he placed on the Spanish throne, was not respected by any of the marshals, basically.
Yeah, he was originally king of Naples, if I remember correctly, and he was doing good all right with that, but then he got shuffled off to Spain, and he
actually tried to be a good king. He did try and be. He wasn't an evil man by any means, but the Spanish hated him because Napoleon had got rid of their real king and what have you,
he was unfortunately
was holding them prisoner, basically.
Well, and also, unfortunately, he was a bit of he was a bit of a modernist in the sense, he abolished the Inquisition. Contrary to belief, though, he didn't revoke the privileges of the church. It just meant that he was not allowing it to have the equal privilege of, I guess, the monarchy. It wasn't like a Catholic monarchy as such. It was just one thing below it, sort of thing.
Yeah, but none of the French marshals took a lot of notice of him. Is the main point. Let's talk a little bit about Wellington, and we'll talk a little bit first about Sir John Moore. And the tune I'm going to play at the end of this video it relates to Sir John Moore, and of course Sir John Moore was killed at the Battle of Corunna. And Wellington at that time had already won a couple of battles in Portugal at Roliça and the other one that he won there. Then he was replaced, and then they brought Moore in. Now, Moore was a great trainer of troops, particularly light infantry. But one of the things you have to realise is that Moore was a Whig. Sir John Moore was a Whig politically, whereas, of course, Wellington was a Tory. And that had an effect on things. But Wellington had a brilliant eye for ground. He was one of, if not the best, battlefield commanders in the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, he didn't lose a battle in Spain at all. He came close once or twice, but he never did. His biggest problems were with sieges, and as I explained earlier in this stream, the Whigs turned into liberals, Dominus Diabolis. That's what happened to the Whigs. They turned into liberals in Britain.
The Whigs were at one point were basically the a very Protestant. I guess in his because John Moore was Scot, so it would have been Presbyterian.
Could
Like
be, yeah.
the Presbyterian thing, and if you look at elections and stuff, you'll see particularly parts of Scotland, the I guess you could say like today the orange areas, the more unionist areas of Scotland. You had a lot of Whigs, and
Yes.
you had a faction of the Tories then who were quite Jacobite. They were quite Catholic and everything. But I think probably by this time,
Also, some of the Whigs were quite Jacobite as well, to be fair.
yeah, I mean, by this time, though, I will say by this time, that fraction of the Tories was gone by then. It just wasn't around. But yeah.
But there were certainly very Jacobite Whig politicians in
Oh yeah. The effects of the American Revolution and French Revolution, all that sort of
Yes.
stuff. Yeah.
Absolutely. Wellington, of course, was a Tory, but anyway, But Wellington, he in terms of actual battlefield command, he was definitely one of the best generals in the Napoleonic era. I mean, he defeated every French marshal who was sent against him, and of course, eventually he defeated Napoleon himself at Waterloo. And we do have a stream on the Battle of Waterloo. If you guys in the chat or people watching this later on want to go and check it out, we do have a stream. We've got a pretty good panel for that as well. So if you want to go and check out our Waterloo stream, do so.
I was going to sorry. The highlight for that has to be that like Dutch militia who were chasing with like, what was it? Like bayonets and a scythe and some French dragoons in the middle of battle, like hopped over a hedge and chased them. Chased them with like gardening tools and things like that.
Yeah. Dominus Diabolus, who were the Jacobites? In British terms, you're talking about the people who supported the Stuarts, basically. But when we're using Jacobite and Jacobin and what have you, we're really talking about lefty Frenchmen in this era.
I think they're confusing Jacobite and Jacobins.
Yes.
Jacobins, yeah.
Yes.
The Jacobins were entirely a French, a radical, anti-clerical French faction who would, they were. Aaron, they were a club, a specific club, weren't they?
Yes, they were. Yeah, they were one of the factions within the French. What's the National Assembly? Yeah, and they weren't the most left wing, but they were the most ruthless, shall we say?
Wasn't that Robespierre? That was Robespierre's faction.
Yes, it was. Yeah, and so
and it's also where we get left and right from is where people sat in that French assembly. But anyway,
I was going to say the Jacobites were uber. I mean, they were basically Catholic.
Yes.
Uber traditionalists. They wanted Britain to return to Catholicism,
and they were pro the Stuarts. Yes, they were the guys who fought in the 45 rebellion and all this kind of stuff.
The Jacobins were. I mean, they were anti-clerical. I mean, they invented a new religion. I mean, they were completely mental. And under that tree where Robespierre was delivering like this speech on virtue, and then created like the cult of reason or whatever it was, and the mob of Paris just laughed at him, and he threw a hissy fit. So, yeah,
indeed. But anyway, to get us back to the subject of the stream. Wellington was a very good battlefield commander. He was very good at sorting out his supply lines and all this kind of stuff. He was a pretty strict disciplinarian. And as I've said a couple of times in this stream, he was definitely quite capable of having soldiers flogged and also hung, and he did so, and shot occasionally, and that sort of thing. When his army lost their discipline, he became very angry about it. John Robertson's asking, how did the soldiers feel about Wellington? Wellington was trusted because he was careful with his men's lives. He didn't waste his soldiers because unlike Napoleon, for example, he didn't have endless soldiers. He had the main British army in the peninsula, and it couldn't really be replaced if he lost it. So he had to be much more careful with his soldiers' lives than Napoleon was. And he was also, I think, a better man. I mean, Wellington was seen in open tears twice. Once outside the breach at Badajoz, which was covered in dead British soldiers who were killed storming the place. And again, after the Battle of Waterloo, where so many of his soldiers were killed, particularly by the French artillery. And he was seen in tears about his losses at least twice, and certainly no one would have ever seen Napoleon doing that. Napoleon didn't give a shit about his soldiers, basically. He would claim he did when it suited him, but I don't actually think he cared about them at all. Whereas Wellington was a better man than that. But he said himself in later life, when people asked him, what would you have changed in your younger days, when Wellington was a grand old man and had been Prime Minister of Britain and all this kind of stuff. Wellington thought about it for a while, and he said, I should have given more praise because he wasn't good at that. I think Wellington actually regarded most of his officers, let alone the other ranks, but certainly even most of his officers, I think he regarded most of them with intellectual contempt. Wellington was a very, very insightful and intelligent officer, outstandingly so. And I don't think he regarded the brain power much of his officers. He didn't think much of them. And as a result of that, he certainly didn't think much of the brain power of most of his other ranks. So, and in that he was wrong, by the way. In that he was wrong.
I mean, the only person he really spoke fondly of on a number of occasions was when he met Lord Nelson.
Yes, and at first he didn't like Nelson either, because Nelson could be quite vain on occasions, and Wellington was many things. Wellington was known to his officers as the beau, by the way, because he used to always dress very smartly, but he wouldn't dress in a military fashion. If you look at the thumbnail for this video, you'll see Wellington's wearing a blue cloak and a blue coat. He very seldom wore his full dress uniform in the field. He'd occasionally wear it, like when he first entered Madrid and this kind of stuff, he'd get dressed up in his full dress uniform. But other than that, he would almost never wear it. He was always like toned down in that regard, but he was always very smart in terms of his dress. But not particularly military. Duke Valentino, have we seen the film Waterloo? I would imagine we all have. I certainly have. And by the way, Duke Valentino, you can find that movie on YouTube if you want to watch it. And it is quite a good film. There are things wrong with it, but it's not bad.
Yeah, I've seen it a number of times. I think Christopher Plummer, who was portraying Wellington, does
a good job.
Does a good job, yeah. I forget the American actor who did Napoleon, but I think he did a quite good job as well.
Rod Steiger.
That's Steiger. That's right. He did quite a good job in that, and the director, the Soviet director, also in the 60s did the three-part epic, Russian epic, War and Peace. If you look at I would actually say the battle scene at Borodino rivals the Battle of Waterloo on the scope and scale.
Yeah, I'm wanting to agree with that one. I've watched it as well. Especially, you have the 2016 series where it doesn't show that famous scene of the Russian soldiers praying to the sacred icon, whereas in that 1968 version, they actually do, for 5 minutes, where it's showing the Russian soldiers praying towards it. And it's one of the things where it's kind of ironic, because you think Soviet Union, naturally you think, okay, massively religious and so on, but they still pay the respects that way to a massive part of Russian Christian heritage.
Yeah, the director, he was quite...
The extras in that movie Waterloo are actually Russian soldiers, aren't they?
They're Russian, they're Czech. I think there's quite a few Czech ones.
But they're Warsaw Pact soldiers for the most part.
Yeah, Warsaw Pact. I mean, the one that I mentioned, the Borodino one, the War and Peace in the 60s, That was roughly about. I think it was it was about 100,000 extra soldiers used as extras from Soviet army, and the Polish, the People's Polish, and the again Eastern Bloc and Romania and stuff. So it was I mean, and lots of horses, and I think some men died in the Borodino, like in real life. Men actually
In the
died.
Waterloo film, lots of horses died as well, sadly.
Yeah, the Borodino one, you can actually see there's a shot which I actually think a couple men died because not just one horse but several horses land on this one guy, and I have fallen off a horse, and where a horse has like tried to roll, once got funny and tried to roll on me as well. So I know, yeah, I'm like, yeah, that guy probably
Horses
if
are
he died.
horses are quite big, heavy creatures. Yes.
Oh god,
Um,
and they're fucking annoying when they start misbehaving as well.
Yeah. John Robertson, what was the name of the other film, and is it on YouTube? I think they're talking about War and Peace, and I have no idea. I don't know.
Yeah, it's on YouTube. If you type in War and Peace 1966 Part 1, it will come up with the first film, and then it should be underneath in the playlist or something. Um the other ones. Yeah, you look up Moz film, yeah. There's actually, I really want to do a stream one day, might do it with you guys if you wanted, of actually just reviewing Soviet era films because they're really good. Like
Yeah.
they're really the Soviet films, and it's really funny because I always go back to sort of like an obscure George Lucas interview, which he got a bit told off for saying this back like in the 70s, but he said, "Oh yeah, like the Soviets filmmakers have more freedom than I have in Hollywood."
I guess
Yeah.
Mitch would probably be up for that one. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be.
Yeah. The Brezhnev era, especially, is one where it's quite. There's a lot of artistic things, like for example Tarkovsky, for example, because it's funny. A lot of let's say Western liberals think that Khrushchev was the best guy in the Soviet Union. No, he wasn't. There was a lot more censorship on him because, for example, let's say Tarkovsky wanted to do Andrei Rublev. He couldn't do it under Khrushchev. He had to wait until Brezhnev was around before he could release that film, for example. So it's like the Brezhnev era is kind of like I don't know how to articulate other than saying like he wasn't disdainful of, I suppose, like European culture. Like, he was. You had a lot more freedom to just make a film about Christian heritage Russia from a medieval period, as well as, for example, but also if you want to laugh, you know, you got that whole literally me with like Ryan Gosling. Well, there's a Russian version of that where it's just like these like movie characters from like Soviet films back from the 80s, and it's like there's this one, for example, there's a Soviet film called Korea, where it's just basically this young lad who's basically neat, and he's wanted to avoid joining the army. And he ends up having to join the army, and that's basically the whole literally me meme, but for Russians.
Yeah.
There's
a Soviet there's one of and the Novgorod one, the Prince Alexander as well. That's a Soviet era one. That's a good one to check out as well.
I'm very happy to do what you wanted to do, AI, and I do a thing on Soviet movies, but just to pull us back to the topic of this stream, someone's saying in the chat, Alabaster's saying, annoyed about horses biting and throwing their heads about. That reminds me, Wellington's most famous charger was Copenhagen, who was quite well known for kicking and biting when he was Wellington's charger. Wellington rode him all day at Waterloo, as well as at some of the battles in the peninsula. And he was always an excellent horse. He had good staying power, didn't shy away from the gunfire and all this kind of stuff. And Wellington rode him for a little while in London after Waterloo, but eventually retired him to his estate, where he had a nice, comfortable stable and nice big fields to run around. And the local women and kids would come and feed him treats. And Copenhagen famously became very soft in the end and didn't bite or kick anybody. So when he retired, he became a nice horse who little kids could go and feed a bun to and stuff like that, you know. And apparently he didn't always get food he should have eaten because people used to spoil him. But he lived to a reasonable age. He was buried in the 1830s, and Wellington buried him underneath an oak tree. And at one stage, the Royal United Services Museum wanted to exhibit his Copenhagen, the horse's skeleton, next to Napoleon's horse Marengo's skeleton. And Wellington famously forgot where he buried him and said, "Oh, I can't remember where I buried him now," because he didn't want his horse's skeleton put on display next to Marengo. Again, Wellington was a nicer man than Napoleon, in my opinion. But anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt the Soviet film discussion, guys, but the thing is, if people tune into this for Wellington's British Army, they're probably going to be confused about us discussing Soviet movies. Although I see the reason for talking about War and Peace, of course. But anyway, I'm AI. If you decide to do that stream, I don't know how much I could contribute to it, but I think it's a good idea, and I'm sure Mitch would be an excellent guest on that because he's into that stuff. Guys, we've been going for about an hour and 3/4. Final thoughts from people, please.
I'd say the thing about Wellington was I'd be quite. I mean, there's one YouTuber who's got good reactions to all this. Is vlogging through history. He reacted to the epic history Napoleonic War, where he talks a bit about Wellington and compares him to some American Civil War generals. But his whole point is Wellington was able to get into the mind of someone like Napoleon, and that's why Wellington was probably one of the most successful commanders of the entire Napoleonic Wars period. Stop.
Yeah, he could anticipate what the enemy were going to do. That's a very good point, Mitch.
Yeah, whereas you take someone like Napoleon. I mean, Bernard Cornwell is a bit charitable when he says like Napoleon. When he said the famous comment about Wellington being a sepoy general, and that he's not that great. Apparently, Bernard Cornwell would say try and be a bit charitable and said, "Oh, well, Napoleon said that to try and." Boost his marshals' morale because his marshals are of course they're a bit iffy about the idea of fighting Wellington. That they've got experience of him
because he's beaten them all. Yes.
Yeah,
I mean the British Army, even without Wellington, at battles like Albuera, for example, and that wasn't the only one. Was still able to beat the French in the peninsula just because the British Army of the early 1800s was a damn good army. It was, and most of its officers were entirely competent. Most of its NCOs were very competent, and the guys were well trained, and they never lacked courage.
Yeah, that's like the Peninsula War was kind of like the perfect theatre for us because supply wasn't too much of a problem given Royal Navy dominance of the seas, plus also it wasn't that massively. It's not like, let's say, supplying Robert Clive over in Bengal in the 1750s, or supplying, let's say, the War of 1812. Its logistical side wasn't as much of a. Plus, also we could, the major arm. Like, I'm trying to think how big our army was in the Peninsula War because it would be like 50,000 or something like that, or something like that. Whereas the Spanish guerrillas would be a lot of guys doing heavy lifting in terms of harassing French small army outfits. I think like there's a graffiti, I can't remember the precise wording, but it goes that soldiers' grave, or like something like soldiers' death, officers' graveyard, and generals' ruin, or something like that. I have a French.
Yeah,
perceived the Peninsula
absolutely.
War.
In terms
Not just
of the
because
size
of
of,
but also because how damn good our army was. Because you got that famous quote by Marshal Soult where he says, I turned the left and right flanks at Albuera. I surrounded them. I have blasted them, but these English soldiers still don't know when to quit, basically."
Yep, that's very true. In terms of the size of Wellington's army, it grew over time. And let's remember that Wellington actually invaded France in 1814. Eventually, he was the first of the Allied forces to actually get onto French territory. And by 1814, he had, I think it was 7 or 8 divisions, including the Portuguese. And the Anglo-Portuguese Spanish army before he invaded France was about 60,000 men, so it was quite large. And about 2/3 of it was British, or King's German Legion. And when he invaded France, he actually left the Spanish troops behind because he knew what the Spanish troops would do to the French peasants, and so he didn't take them. Although he did take the Portuguese, because by that stage the Portuguese were quite well disciplined. But his army did grow, and as I say, he had 7 or 8 divisions by 1814, and was actually on French territory and beating the French in France. In fact, it was the anniversary of one of his Soult's last attempts to try and win in the Pyrenees was yesterday, if I remember correctly, which failed, by the way. Wellington won. But anyway, so Wellington did eventually not only liberate and hold Portugal, but he liberated Spain and eventually invaded the south of France as well. And he did that before the Prussians, the Russians, or the Austrians had got into French territory. And it's also worth pointing out that although he said at Waterloo he had an infamous army, which indeed he did, because many of the best British regiments were still in Canada and America, where they'd been sent for the War of 1812, which actually went on until 1814, and we will do a stream about that at some stage, the War of 1812. But most of the best British battalions had still not come back from Canada. And so the army that he had at Waterloo had a lot of second battalions, a lot of British second battalions, some of which were under strength. And also, of course, he had heaps of Allied troops, many of whom had been fighting for Napoleon only a year previously. So he did indeed have an infamous army at Waterloo in that regard. He said of his Peninsular Army, his Peninsular War British Army, that with that army, he could go anywhere and do anything. So in the end, he was quite appreciative of that British army.
And the Prime Minister in 1814 asked if he could go to Canada to, and his response was, "No, I'm more." Basically, it was like, "No thanks, I'm more useful here. It's not worth my time."
Well, he actually said, "What the devil is there to attack?" Because I mean, other than Washington, there wasn't anything basically.
It's like biggest, like, I mean, there's a massive disrespect to the Yanks.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you it's kind of like when you hear about certain towns in Central Europe that didn't get attacked by the Ottomans because the Sultan said, "Oh, they're not important enough to attack." That's basically.
But yeah, so any final thoughts, Aaron?
I'd just say that I'd agree with you. Wellington was certainly the greatest general in the Napoleonic era, definitely better than Napoleon. And I'd say he almost, to my mind, rivals Marlborough as the greatest British general.
For sure, yeah, it's out of those two always.
Yeah,
it is. It's out of those two always, and it's also worth bearing in mind that Wellington had to be something of a diplomat in the Peninsular War as well, because he had to he had to cooperate with the Spanish juntas, who were not the easiest of people to work with, shall we say. How many battles was Wellington in? A lot, Duke Valentino, but you know, Google is your friend. But it was about the same number as Napoleon, actually, because don't forget, Wellington was in a lot of battles in India before the Peninsular War.
Well, he was in the Netherlands. He was in the Netherlands, I think, before India.
Yes, he did also fight under the Duke of York in the disastrous campaign in the Netherlands. Yes, he did. Yeah. Whereas Wellington said he learned what not to do.
So. Yeah. As for Wellington, I mean, I think Wellington could only speak English and French because he spoke to Oliver, his Spanish friend, in French. But also, Plus, also another thing was what was it?
I would imagine he picked up a bit of Spanish in his time in Portugal and Spain.
What
I'm
about
sure I'm sure he
Gaelic?
picked up a bit, but he could. No, he didn't speak that, but he could definitely. He spoke good French because he went to a French military academy as a young man.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, and
When France was still royalist, by the way.
yeah, and the other thing was I mean, I know like I know one thing about I think like another thing about like what Waterloo was like you take the amount of artillery we had of a battle. HMS a broadside from HMS Victory had more firepower than Wellington's entire
did.
artillery.
Yeah, it
at
did.
Waterloo.
Most British field guns in the peninsula were 6 or 9 pounders, and we used 5-inch howitzers. Whereas on Victory, the lightest guns on Victory were 12 pounders, but there were also 24 pounders and 36 pounders and even 68 pounder carronades. So Victory had a lot more firepower than all of Wellington's artillery at Waterloo.
I reckon he would have picked up Latin when he was at the French Academy as well.
Possible. I really don't know that. I've read quite a lot about Wellington, and I can't recall. But then maybe I just didn't pay any attention to that. But he did certainly go to a royalist French military academy for a while because his mother famously said, "Arthur is only fit for powder." Although actually, as a young man, he was quite artistic, and he used to play the violin. But some chick rejected him, and he burnt his violin on a fire and never played again.
You find you have people in history who are quite creative and artistic, and then something changes in their lives, and then they become like these great figures in politics or military or something else.
Possibly, yeah, that's true.
Absolutely true. I mean, that was true of Enoch Powell, who was before the Second World War a great clarinetist. He could have made a career as a musician, but academic life called as he went off to that.
I'm going to recommend to people the book The Iron Duke by Richard Holmes. It was a TV series which you used to be able to find episodes of on YouTube, but I don't know if you still can. But The Iron Duke by Richard Holmes is a good biography. As we were saying earlier, Oman's history of the Peninsular War is impossible to beat. That's just brilliant. There's an audio version of that on YouTube, which is pretty good, by the way.
Yeah, I've got the audio. I've got the audio version on Audible, all of them. I will say with Oman though, is you do need a bit of prior knowledge about the Peninsular War and the people in it. I find.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I've read quite a lot about the Peninsular War, so that's probably true.
I'm saying if you're somebody who's watching this, I mean, because we know a bit about it, but if you are watching this and you know nothing about it, I would say you may struggle a bit following Oman.
Also, check out the YouTube channel Redcoat History, because he's got a lot of stuff on the Peninsular War. But he's also doing a series at the moment with a guy called Marcus Cribb, where they're actually walking the battlefields in the peninsula. So that's well worth checking out as well. Redcoat History, very good. And again, earlier I mentioned Rob's British Muzzle Loaders channel. That's got quite a lot of stuff on the Peninsular War in it as well, including a lot of practical shooting with Brown Bess muskets and Baker rifles and stuff like that.
Yeah, I would say one thing about the Spanish, right? So because this is one thing that amuses me, is like when the Spanish have a go at us over the Peninsular War, claiming that we screwed them over, and I'm sort of thinking, if anything, the Spanish do a good job screwing themselves, going off like over the Peninsular War. Like, it's a matter of I mean, that's a common occurrence in our history where every time we work with someone, we just get the short end of the stick.
Usually,
And
usually.
I
yeah,
mean,
and
it's a
it's
bit
like,
cheeky of the Spanish to claim that. They sided with, literally the devil. They got burnt, betrayed, and burnt. And
Yep.
then they have the sort of the audacity. And then when we actually come in to do provide some aid and support, then they win about it later. I mean, that's
Well,
sort of being ungrateful.
it's worth pointing out that Nelson's great victory at Trafalgar was against the Franco-Spanish fleet. The Spanish were allies of Napoleon, and in the end,
Yeah.
they paid for it because Napoleon screwed them up the rear end, basically.
yeah, and it's I think it was Bismarck who said it best. Spain must be the strongest country in the world because their own elites have tried to destroy them for ages and they've still not succeeded.
Yeah, some truth, some truth. Aaron, anything you'd like to plug, sir?
Yes, well, my channel is Aaron James Hook, where I cover a lot of books, but also films. And this Sunday just gone, I did a live stream with Duke about our favourite British and Commonwealth film, which was really good. And I will be doing this Friday at 7 p.m. British time a live stream about the 1970s and 1980s crime action show, The Professionals. If that sounds interesting.
I remember that. Yeah. Aaron Hook. Check out Aaron James Hook, which is his YouTube channel. There will be details below the stream later on. AI, would you like to plug your channel, sir?
Yeah, it's AI Shire Homelander, and I've got an interview tomorrow at 2 p.m. now with Jack Hadfield. Now, people who've been on social media and been seeing the clips of the migrant hotel protests in Epping and Canary Wharf, and today in Plymouth. A lot of those clips will be came from Jack, who's been on the ground there, including the famous one where the Green councillor got confronted by some patriots down at Canary Wharf. There was the one where she was saying we need safe and legal routes for migrants and asylum seekers, and you have like Essex man who comes in and calls her an effing C word, and
Quite correct. He was quite correct as well.
I don't usually agree with like public that sort of crass behavior in public, but do you know what? That was needed. That was like a cathartic, putting that sort of cat lady shit away. It has to be done. So I was glad that happened, and
that will be a good. That will be an interesting interview you're going to do there, AI.
Yeah, I mean that's with Jack, and he also covered a lot of the riots and South protests last year, about this time last year. So yeah, it should be good, and I believe he was the one to break, and this is what I want to talk about. He was the one that sort of corroborated that the police not only evacuated the stand up to racism protesters, who it was all organised by the trade unions, which are a militant wing of the Labour Party, and that of the government.
Yeah,
but
all those posters were they come from an organisation which is government funded.
Yeah, and I have actually got a document here by someone anonymous who I'm not going to mention, but where it shows the union Unison organising previous demos by busing them in and everything, and working with police liaison officers. So I've got I mean, we already know this stuff, but I've got it in sort of a document format that sort of corroborates that. Jack Hadfield was able to record and get footage of the police bringing them to the demo from, I presume, from the station at Epping, in police vans and things like that. So in buses and police vans. So
that will be good, and AI Shire Homelander is AI's channel. I would certainly recommend that stream, and there will be a link to AI's channel under the stream later on. I need to go and check if we got any entropy chats, which I forgot to remind people about. While I do think of it, guys, please like the stream. It really does help if you press that little thumbs up button. And I'll have a quick check and see if we got any entropy chats. Probably not, because I forgot to tell people about it. Mitch, anything you would like to plug, sir?
Nah, not from me.
All right. Right, we didn't get any, but that's my fault because I forgot to remind people that you could send us super chats there. So there we go. All right. We will be back on Saturday for Splendid Isolation, our normal weekend show, when we look at current affairs, news and politics, basically from a right of centre point of view, from a sane point of view. Do come and join us for that. Like I say, make sure you hit the like button. Thank you very much to my guests, Aaron Hook, Mitch, and AI. And I am going to play us out with a tune. There we go. Oh. Make sure it works. And that tune was Sir John Moore, who was, of course, the commander in the Peninsula before the Duke of Wellington. And that comes from Patriotic Archive. If you like traditional naval and military music, and also these days he has quite a lot of folk music and what have you on there, do go and check out Patriotic Archive. He's a good friend of the channel. All right, guys, we will see you 9:30 British time on Saturday for Splendid Isolation. Number 235 or whatever it is. I've been doing it for years now. But anyway, we'll see you for that. Thank you again to my guests, and don't let the bastards grind you down.